Today, for the Founder Things podcast, we're changing it up a little bit. We moved away from the two beverages, two cigars, two topics format. And what we're doing instead is actually something really fun, really fantastic, in my opinion. I would call maybe the most whiskey guru-like character I might know personally. We've got Peter Silver here today. How's it going, Peter?
Great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, one thing that comes to mind for me that I, as soon as I heard the story from you originally, wanted to get on camera was, what are your origins in being a sort of whiskey fanatic, as you might consider yourself?
It had to be at least 25, maybe 30 years ago. I grew up in a household where the only alcohol was like Manischewitz with a metal cap that was crusted, dried with sugar on it, and we were forced to drink it during the holidays, and I thought it was disgustingly sweet and unpleasant. So there wasn't a lot of alcohol in a Jewish household, and to this day I'm sure there's fewer Jewish alcoholics than other groups. But I went to college and I drank beer, and then a friend turned me on to Tanqueray, and I drank Tanqueray and tonics for years because I just didn't have my major own opinions about alcohol. And then I was invited to a friend's birthday party, and I called up his wife and said, "What does he like to drink?" And she said, "Single malt scotch." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I don't know." So I went to the local liquor store, which for me was Warehouse Liquors in Manhattan on Broadway. They had about 30 different whiskeys at that point. Now they have well over 200. And I was staring at the wall going, I have no idea which one to get, when a woman's voice from behind me with a lot of roughness in it said, "Get the Macallan 18. You can drink a whole bottle and not have a hangover the next day." And I thought, that's good advice from a cancer-ridden alcoholic. Thank you, ma'am. So I went outside to a payphone, because this is before cell phones, which is before most of you were born, before cell phones. And I called up his wife on the payphone, and just as I was saying to her, "Which one does he like?" and she was saying, "I don't know," a guy in a kilt walks past me and goes into the liquor store. So I figure I have to ask the guy in the kilt. So he goes in there and speaks to the owner. I wait till he's done. Then I get his ear and I say, "Can you recommend a single malt for a friend's birthday?" He goes, "Is it a good friend?" I go, "Yes." He goes, "Get the Macallan 18. I'm like, both people said the same thing. Back then, the Macallan 18 was distilled in 1975, and I think, and it was all exclusively sherry cask, and it was an incredible whiskey, but I didn't know that. And it was about $80. So I said, it's more than I wanted to spend, but if everyone says get it, I'll get it. So I present it to my friend when I get to the party. He gets all very excited and goes, "Oh, you got to try this." And I'm thinking, no, because the image I've seen of whiskey is old men in a bar doing shots, grunting in pain, and then washing it down with a beer as if to get the taste out of their mouth, which is some strange male bonding ritual that I want no part of. And he's like, no, you're going to really like this. I'm like, yeah, right. Just give me the smallest amount possible and I'll try to endure it. So he pours me a little taste. I take a taste, and I had never tasted anything like that in my life. The incredible sherry, the balance, the sweetness. And the next day I read Michael Jackson's book from cover to cover, and a couple months later I was on my honeymoon in Scotland, and I had a list of everything Michael Jackson had rated 90 and above. So every bar I went into and every liquor store I went into, I was asking for these things. And what I had no idea was that Michael had listed a lot of esoteric things that were no longer available. So I can't tell you how many times I was told to go fuck myself with a heavy Scottish accent when I made these requests. Because they're like, "We're going to sell you what we have. Go fuck yourself if you want these other things." But I came back with 8 bottles from that trip, and that was the start of my whiskey collection. And I've been buying whiskey ever since, and still, as recently as a month ago, still buying whiskey. And I probably have more than I can drink in a lifetime, but I'm going to do my best to drink it and share it with my friends.
That's awesome. It's funny because when we originally sort of talked about that same thing the other day, my brain being less initiated with a lot of the figures, historically at least, of the whiskey community, and he said Michael Jackson's book, and my brain is thinking about the pop artist, and I'm like, Okay, yeah, I'm not gonna ask this.
Well, this is not the gloved one, but the one who's known for writing about beer and whiskey. He passed away like 4 years ago, but he was beloved by other writers, and he was internationally renowned for his writing on whiskey and beer, and basically wrote what's considered the tabula rasa of all the whiskey books, where he would list almost every single whiskey from A to Z and give you his feelings. He was very partial to Macallan and gave them a lot of high scores. And that was earlier Macallan. But I mean, if you wanted to read about, I mean, now there's a plethora of books out there, and you can get a great education from a lot of different people. But Michael Jackson was very easy to read, could take in little chunks. You could look up a specific distillery and, you know, read about that, read about the flavor profile, and then see which ones he recommended and what score he gave them. And he wrote articles for lots of whiskey magazines, and wrote other books on beer, and which I have not read. But he was a very skilled writer. I think every night before he went to bed, he drank some whiskey. And he was when I met him in person, he was just really friendly and really nice. That's the reference from Michael Jackson. Definitely worth looking into. They are still writing his book, but they have other people writing it under his, under his umbrella.
Sure.
But he's not with us anymore.
A couple times you've referenced like old Macallan relative to some of the newer stuff they put out, and the identity of the brand and how it shifted over time. What's your take on how and why and what it's become?
Well, it used to be exclusively sherry cask, and they used to market the age factor. They were like, if you work hard, you can get a bottle of the 12-year-old. And if you work really hard and you're successful, you can get a bottle of the 18-year-old. And if you are incredibly successful, you might be almost worthy of the 25-year-old. That's how they marketed it. And they spent well over $1 million, I think, in marketing their whiskey, saying, we are the best, we are the best, we are the best. So now when anyone goes to buy whiskey, they see Macallan, it's a recognized brand, and in their head they're hearing it's the best, it's the best. So they've used that incredibly well to sell their whiskey and position their whiskey in the market. And on the secondary market, if you're going to buy anything for investment purposes, Macallan is the one that brings the most money if you resell something. And that's why their whiskey has brought the highest prices, and especially older ones, the 1930, 1920 something is bringing, they broke the $50,000 mark, then they broke 60,000. I don't know what the latest, most oldest thing is, but most likely it's undrinkable, because when you reach a certain age point, it just tastes like wood because it's been sitting in a cask that long. But no one's going to open it and drink it. They're just going to keep flipping it and hope it'll bring more money, which for me, that's not what whiskey is about. Whiskey's about opening it and drinking it and sharing it with your friends, and not spending $30,000-$50,000 on a bottle.
Yeah.
They after they had spent and established themselves with older whiskey being better and more expensive, then they ran out of older whiskey, and then they were bought out by another company, and then they started saying, we're going to put out no age statements, and don't you worry your pretty little head about the age. We know when the whiskey is best. You'll just have to trust us. Take the no age statement and shut up. So that's what they've been marketing for quite a while now, and a lot of people who used to be highly regarded in the industry who work there have left, but they're still putting out whiskey, and I haven't tasted everything they put out. I'm sure some of it's good, some of it might be great, and some of it is probably mediocre, because I've tasted some mediocre Macallans. But one thing we know for sure is all of it will be expensive, because they tend to market their stuff at a higher price point than similar whiskeys. And there's not a lot on the independent bottling market, but it's not my go-to whiskey anymore. If it tasted like it did back when I first had it, I would own multiple bottles of that.
What would you say is your go-to whiskey?
It depends on my mood. Sometimes I want to be caressed. Sometimes I want to be slapped in the face. If I want to be slapped in the face, it's going to be an Ardbeg, a Lafroig, a Lagavulin, or a Talisker. If I want to be caressed, it's going to be a Springbank, a Mortlock, something of a gentler nature. So there's so many incredible whiskeys out there, and I really like having the full variety. I don't want to just drink one kind and one kind only.
My perspective as of late has been that I think whiskey for the longest time did have sort of the perspective that you said, but folks, they shoot it in westerns and stuff like that, and drink a beer, or even in a more modern sense, I think people had that perspective that it was strictly an older man's, a gentleman's beverage. But in the modern era, at least in my experience, it's sort of becoming a bit more trendy, and I think there's a big young audience. Especially, for example, in like the YouTube community, there's a lot of people who are, I would say, sub 40, which generally speaks is pretty young, but even sub, I would say 30 for some folks. Have you found that to be the case? That do you find that? Sorry, the dog there's. Is becoming a bit more in trend or like in vogue as opposed to historically, or have you not really noticed that?
Well, I think they definitely want people to know it's not your father's or grandfather's whiskey, and they've been marketing to younger, skewed age groups, and I think that's great. You got to get young people interested in it, and I think they came out with all these flavored whiskeys, everything from cinnamon flavor to peanut butter flavor to who knows what flavor they're coming out with next. And that might be a way for someone to say, oh, I'll try this, and then be willing to try something else, which I think is fine. I mean, there are people that listen to Kenny G, and then they start learning about real jazz. And Kenny G is like a gateway drug to get you started on listening to real jazz. So whatever gets people interested in drinking it, I think that's a great thing. So I want to see, and they have the events. Like Whiskey Live is geared towards a younger audience. It's like, oh, it's a hip, cool place. I'm going to walk around. I'll try some whiskey. I'll have an experience. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll eat some food. And, that's what they were doing, and that worked really well for them. So I think anytime they can get people to try whiskeys and have an open mind about it and not scare them off, that's great.
I don't think we mentioned what we're drinking at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
It's the Port Charlotte 10-year. I'm privy to it, and as you sort of felt, I think it does take water pretty well. I kind of splash them in. What's been your impression of it so far?
Is this the heavily peated one?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just got a bottle of this, and this is my first time tasting it. It's nicely peated. It's not over on the limit on the peat, which is good, because sometimes they just do intense peat, and you could just be sucking on an ashtray, which you guys might like that. But I don't like that.
Might be good for you.
With a little water, I found it to be much more palatable. It brings up the sweetness. There's definitely a huge amount of delicious smoke, and I think it's a really good whiskey. I think it's under $100.
60?
Yeah, I think I paid about 60.
That's a good price.
Yeah. I find it to be
So that's a good buy.
pretty complex and tasty for that kind of money.
Yeah, I'm sure I will enjoy it when I open the bottle. But it's delicious now. I definitely would say it's worth having in your collection.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And only being my second time drinking it, the first time was only on the rocks. But this is, I would say, my first more analytical take on it. And yeah, no, it's
pretty much everything I've had from Bruichladdich has been pretty tasty. I haven't had a giant selection, but I've had a couple of Octomore. I've had the classic Laddie, and then the Port Charlotte. And
I mentioned the lineage on Bruichladdich was Jim McEwen, and so if this was made 10 years ago, he very well had a hand in making this. Jim McEwen, master distiller for Bruichladdich and other distilleries before that, known for his flair and showmanship in doing PR, but also known for creating great whiskey and taking risks too, doing a lot of finishes and on some whiskeys that may not have been that great, and then trying to save them by finishing them in something. And some of those were successful, and some of those were wildly unsuccessful. But at least he didn't give up on the whiskey. He was trying to save it, because they put it in a barrel, and there's no guarantee how it's going to come out.
Sure.
So But he's a very interesting character, and he's featured in a lot of films about whiskey. There are movies about whiskey you can see on Netflix, documentaries on Netflix and on other things that are worth watching. And if he's talking, he's worth listening to.
Have to check those out. I've got a Netflix subscription.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think they have a show on bourbon and a show about Scotch.
Huh.
So worth seeing.
Yeah, the bourbon sort of subculture is very, very interesting in the sense that I feel like there are a lot of people that would even go as far as say that, like, oh, I don't really drink a lot of whiskey, or like I'm not really into whiskey, not into Scotch, but really into bourbon. And like I know one guy like that actually, and it's interesting how folks tend to sort of put themselves into a little sect of the overall community. I don't tend to feel that way, and it seems like you don't tend to either, really, although I guess the vast majority of your collection is Scotch. Why do you think that is, that the folks tend to sort of veer towards one category?
Well, they're two completely different palates, and I know they have a big bourbon fest, or at least they did have one every year, and people would come with huge collections and pour insane stuff for each other and have a great time, and were just as enthusiastic about it as Scotch people are. It really depends on whether you like that flavor profile, which for me is very sweet because of the massive amounts of corn in it. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn, and some of them are way higher than that in corn. I don't know, maybe people like to specialize. I've sort of been specializing in single malts. I haven't had 100 different blends, but I've had thousands of single malts. I have had probably fewer than 200 bourbons, but what I've had I enjoyed. Bourbon is way more affordable than Scotch. So if anyone was just getting into the whole scene on whiskey, I would say focus on bourbons, because you can try a lot more things for a lot less money and build a nice collection without having to mortgage your house. So that would be my advice. But I don't hold the one being better than the other. I think Scotch can be more complex than bourbon, but there are some bourbons that are more complex than simple Scotches. So it really runs the whole gamut. And if someone said this is an amazing bourbon, you have to try it, I would hold out my glass and say, let's have a taste.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense.
there shouldn't be any snobbery in the whiskey area.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I don't. In general, in lots of different communities, and I know, for example, for yourself, you're really heavily involved in like the music community, as well as perhaps like you mentioned coffee, and for us, it's those things, maybe not to the same degree as yourself, it being in so many bands and stuff like that. It's really fantastic, and we can sort of touch on that later. But for audio as well, there's a lot of gatekeeping. And I hate that. I really think it's a bizarre perspective to sort of, I've heard a lot of like accusing people of like, being like a poser is sort of a big thing in lots of different communities.
Well, you're not a real audiophile if you
exactly.
don't. Yeah.
If you don't this or you don't that, and it's bizarre, and I think it's really cool when you meet folks like yourself and that are.
Much more open-minded.
Correct, yeah, progressive in that regard. And I find that to be true, though, with most people who are legitimate enthusiasts and aren't into the thing that they're in for, like, aesthetic or what's the word I'm looking for here? Yeah, the prestige reasons, things like that. When you really just like the thing that you like because you see the beauty in it and you think it's fantastic, people like that tend to be super open and really are just so happy to introduce newcomers, to the community, and it's awesome. I really like to see it, and it's a shame, I think, that some people get scared off from certain communities, and I do particularly see it a lot in audio where there are people that think, oh, well, this guy has a $30, $40, $50, $100,000 system, and well, I can't afford that, so they sort of dismiss it and stick to the more commoditized items as opposed to, well, no. A good example is we did a review of like a $150 pair of speakers that we felt were fantastic and that not necessarily outperformed, but we out-enjoyed those speakers over speakers that costed triple or sometimes 5 times the amount. And I think bourbon's a good example of that sometimes too, where for pretty entry level price point, you can you can get something pretty phenomenal. And lip smacking is kind of a turn of phrase you use a lot, and I like that.
Yeah, that is a good phrase.
Yeah.
If you have to make yourself feel better by denigrating others, then you're behaving like, I don't know, the president of a certain country. I don't know. Someone.
Yeah. No, it's unusual. It's an unusual perspective.
And I think of myself, of all the different categories to put myself in, I think of myself as a whiskey enthusiast, meaning I am enthusiastic about it. I want to share it with others. And the last thing in the world is I want to be considered a whiskey connoisseur or a whiskey snob. Because even though connoisseur is not a bad word, it has a connotation of being a snob. And so I don't even want to go with that. I'm happy to call it whiskey enthusiast and share information and share tastings with other people and turn people on to whiskey and help the whiskey industry sell more whiskey and keep it alive. So
there's a friend of mine who actually, in a similar vein, really hates and rejects the word audiophile, and he finds that again that's the stodgy old angry guy who comments on the internet about how you'll never listen to music the way I listen to music, and you'll never understand because I only listen to 70s Marantz Tube Gear, whatever, these really interesting guys, but. He veers towards the same moniker of audio enthusiast, and he tells me all the time, "You're not an audiophile. You're an audio enthusiast because you're an open and sort of like a happy guy about audio." And I agree. I think audiophile is just sort of the stock standard term. Well, if you really like sound, you might consider yourself an audiophile. But same as with connoisseur, it's not a negative term, but it kind of can.
Some people can view it that way.
Yeah, and some people perpetuate that with their behavior. But
do, which is really too bad for the industry on a whole. Be it for hi-fi or
sure.
be it for fine wine or whiskey. You get the snobs, and then you get people who genuinely love what it is that they consume.
My contention has been, if you can learn to appreciate the particulars and the nuance of anything. You can then learn to appreciate everything. And for me, that sort of started with, at a young age, I was exposed to tea. I was like at my dad's friend's, the office in his business, and he had a little chest of, really, it looked to me like fancy tea. It was in a little, metal box. And I was asking him about it, and he was like, "Oh, it's terrible. I hate it. You can have it." It was a gift, and I was like, "Oh, cool. It was really expensive tea." And I watched some online videos and stuff on really how to brew it at a better level, and I tasted it, and I didn't like it. It had a weird perfumed, floral flavor to me. It was a jasmine tea, and I was uninitiated. The only tea I had experience with to that point was traditional Lipton tea, which my dad drank a lot of. But I sort of told myself, okay, I really need to understand why this is more expensive and considered more prestigious. And so I was, 11 or 12, and I just was like, you know what, I need to just drink this a few more times, and I think eventually then I'll appreciate it. And I did, and what I learned there was, I think, how to taste, and in the broader sense, how to appreciate and dissect things and sort of try to understand them for what they are. But I guess the point I'm getting at is, I find that you can apply the same ideology, whether it's whiskey or wine or chocolate or coffee or tea, to kind of anything, even non-edible things like automobiles or fragrances, things of that nature. Do you think it translates enthusiasm for one particular field?
Absolutely. I mean, you should be hopefully enthusiastic about whatever you choose to do in your life and whatever your hobbies are. Otherwise, why do it?
Yeah.
So, and whether or not you become an expert or not is not important. You should enjoy it at a level that it brings you pleasure, and it's something you look forward to doing and something you take pleasure in doing. That's really important, because if you have to choose between something you hate doing and something that's fun, you want to go with the fun thing.
Yep.
Whenever possible.
You know,
So-
I've always said if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right, or at least striving toward that, right? So you know, as opposed to just you know, settling for what everybody else does, you know, in that particular field or that particular beverage, whatever it may be. You know, at least try to branch out and, you know, try different things, because if you're not doing that, then, you know,
What are you doing?
what
Yeah.
are you doing?
Well, I think
You
if
know?
you care about it, that's really important.
Yeah.
If you don't care about it,
Oh, sure.
then you can just toss it off the cuff. But other than that, you know, if it's something you're really committed to, then you absolutely should pursue it and enjoy it and do it on a level that really means something for you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I guess to me that brings me to your sort of perspective on coffee, and I find a lot of the insight you have there to be just as interesting and honestly more different, like, you know, than sort of your take on whiskey, where I feel like there are a good number of people who I know who really fall in love with whiskey the way you have, and people obviously sort of delve down the path to varying extents, but the perspective is similar and relatable. But with coffee, I would say there's not too many people I know that have sort of taken the same path. Obviously, they exist, but you know, what would you say has been your journey with coffee?
Well, I mean, I used to drink over-the-counter coffee, and I tried Starbucks, and I just found it to be so burned most of the time and unpleasant. And at one point, I was waiting in line because they had a new instant coffee that they were handing out for free, and I took one taste, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
You know, this is horrible. And I looked around at people who were drinking it, and I'm like, can't you tell that this is horrible? You know, it's just undrinkable. But people were drinking it, and I realized, you know, if you care about something and you have the taste buds, you don't want to just take the path of least resistance. So I did some research, and I read up about coffee, read a few books on it, and all of them said the same thing, is that freshly roasted beans are the best. So that means buying green beans, either from a store or from online. For me, it's online is the easiest. And then reading about the flavor profiles so you can see if it's something you want to do, and then roasting the beans yourself, which can be done in the oven, in a frying pan, in a popcorn popper, or you can buy roasting machines, and they sell them as cheaply as around $100, and then they start going up from there, where you can spend $1,000 on a roasting machine. And I worked my way up from the $100 one to the $300, I think, $400 one. And so every week I take it off the top shelf of the cabinet, and I put some fresh beans, green beans in, and I roast a small batch. And I've learned more about roasting profiles and other things that are fun and interesting. And then I have beans that I can use to make coffee. I have a Capresso machine that grinds the beans when you push the button and tamps them down, and you get a nice crema on your coffee. And then I also bought a nitrogen device where you can inject nitrogen into your cold brew coffee. And then I bought a device to chill your coffee without diluting it with ice. And it's like a freezer pack that you stick inside this pitcher, and it chills your coffee down to very cold within 2 minutes. And then it's reusable. So I have all these different accoutrements, but the answer is I generally drink 1 cup of coffee a day. And I have it in the morning. I just want it to be a really delicious cup of coffee. And when I go out, I generally don't drink coffee because it's so... if it's been sitting for more than 20 minutes, it starts degrading and it doesn't taste as good. And people seem to not notice it because they're just shooting it back for caffeine effect. And I don't want that. I don't want to drink something that's... I mean, I'm just not going to drink crappy whiskey. I'm not going to drink crappy coffee. I want to... and it's not about being a snob. It's like, I can taste the difference. Why, when I want to taste the thing that makes me feel good and tastes good to me? So that's my coffee story.
Quick aside, as Peter referred to a couple times, green beans just means unroasted, for anybody who didn't know. But yeah, I totally agree with that sentiment. I think a lot of people tend to associate a love for something as sometimes a snobbery, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And because ultimately, once you become exposed to something that's truly exceptional, it does kind of shed some new light on some of the unexceptional options that are out there.
I think if you eat really good chocolate, you're not going to be happy with the $2 chocolate that you
Correct.
get in the store. It's just going to, oh, this isn't really good. Once you have well-crafted chocolate. So I think it applies to anyone who is conscious when they're putting something in their mouth.
Yeah. You have any particular preferences in terms of regions of the world where you source the beans from?
No, I'm still just trying all different regions and different flavor profiles, and each website that I buy from is very descriptive in the coffee, and so when I read something that sounds fascinating, I mean, yes, I tend to like Ethiopian coffee. I mean, I haven't had many bad Ethiopian coffees, and I have bought Hawaiian coffee when I felt rich enough to do so, and that was spectacular, but and I found an Hawaiian blend in the supermarket that was really good, but the whole purpose of it was to have fresher coffee and not spend as much as on pre-prepared beans, and because coffee prices kept going up. So it was initiated partially by a desire to save some money, and for green beans you can spend 4, 5, 6, around between 5 and 6 a pound, and then go up from there to 8 and 9 and 10 a pound. And if you're buying Hawaiian stuff, it's going to be way more than that. But it's generally less expensive to roast it yourself, other than the time involved. But I think it's infinitely better just to have freshly roasted coffee every week, which, unless you live next to a roaster, you wouldn't have that option.
Sure.
But you don't have to spend all that money. You could just have a sheet pan in the oven roasting your coffee. You don't need the fancy equipment. You don't need any of that stuff. You just need to buy green coffee online.
Would you consider trying to make your own whiskey as you do your coffee?
I've seen how the people who make whiskey, what they do and how hard it is, and I definitively would not make my own. The only thing I've done is buy a little wooden barrel, a tiny little barrel, and I got advice from David Stewart, the master distiller at Balvenie, and he said he would recommend putting Oloroso sherry in it to season it for a couple of months, and then put another whiskey in there that's not too intense to pick up some of the Oloroso sherry. So I've been messing around with that. And that's fun, but making it from scratch or owning my own distillery, I'm more than happy just to buy the product. I have other friends who want to do that, and I have a friend who has successfully made his own whiskey, but I wouldn't be buying it in the store. I'm happy to taste it, but and he buys most of his whiskey, but he still wanted to make some. That is not. I mean, I can understand the desire to do so, but not for me.
That's understandable.
Yeah, no, that is definitely an interesting proposition, and that's one thing I've sort of said to some people, and people have sort of floated that idea to me as well. Oh yeah, you could try distilling it, but number one, I mean, what's been explained to me is that can be kind of dangerous if you don't exactly know what you're doing, but secondarily, yeah, it just seems like incredibly laborious, and not to mention that generally speaking, you're really going to want to wait a few years for the most part, before you can even really sort of enjoy the fruits of your labor. So it's quite the endeavor.
It is a lot of money and a lot of time, and that's why a lot of new distilleries, even though they might want to make whiskey, they will make vodka because they can sell that immediately, and it's easier to distill than whiskey. But it's something that people who've been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years. Those are the people you want to be making it. But there's all these startup distilleries, and they can buy this equipment. The equipment does not come with instructions. It does not come with the training. You either have to have someone who knows what they're doing go in and do it, or you have to go out and learn how to do it. And it's just not easy. And I've had multiple whiskeys from startup places that I find are completely undrinkable because they're in the process of learning their craft.
Sure.
And when it comes to them handing me a whiskey and saying, "Here, what do you think of this?" I don't want to tell them it sucks because they're just learning. They have to. It's like going to a preview during the first rehearsal of a show. It's not going to be a finished, polished product yet. So for me, I tend to bite my tongue and go, "Okay, I see where you're going with this, and keep going and keep working on it because it has potential." and some of them put out very good vodka the first year or two. There's a distillery up in Woodstock, New York, and I tasted their vodka, and it was delicious. And the guy wants to do whiskey, and that was a couple years ago, so maybe he has a decent whiskey now. I don't know, but his vodka was really good. I bought a bottle.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy thing to do, and it sounds like it's incredible fun, but it is not easy to do. So they earn my respect for even attempting to do it.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Any particular young distilleries you'd been exposed to that you found kind of got it right away?
I went to a distillery in Newark, and I'm not going to remember the name of it. I think I showed you their gin, the Cat House gin.
Yes.
But they have other things, and this guy has stuff in the works, and they offer little tours, and nothing now that with COVID, but I think this guy really knows his stuff, and what I've tasted so far is good, and I think he's going to put out some really great stuff. And so I would, whatever I could to support him, I would be happy to do that. And I look forward to him producing more things and then hosting him for a tasting and turning people on to what he's doing.
Any particular whiskey sort of like regions you find are maybe underappreciated?
Well, regions used to be the way that whiskey was defined, because whiskey from a certain region would have a certain flavor profile. And then when smoky and peaty whiskeys caught on, all these other distilleries that were never smoky and peaty started putting out peated versions, some successful and some very unsuccessful, where it tasted like they added liquid smoke to their whiskey versus having it be integrated into the whiskey and be organic. So it seemed that regions were no longer a realistic way of discerning different whiskeys. But in terms of the old style, I find lowlands are not as appreciated because there are not that many of them. Glengoyne is right on the borderline between lowland and another region, and I think it's a spectacular distillery. I had the pleasure of touring it and tasting some things in the warehouse that were just amazing. And I own multiple bottles of Glengoyne in my collection, and I have a 1967 that you saw that I can't wait. I drank one already a couple years ago, but I'm looking forward to cracking that and drinking that with friends because it's a spectacular one. And they've been putting out some great releases. They have a cask strength one that's available from the distillery that's delicious. I bought like 6 bottles of that. So lowlands are great. Another one is Little Mill and Rosebank. Rosebank is no longer in existence, but if you can find something that was from Rosebank, I used to have a 31-year-old Rosebank that was just spectacular. It's a lemony, grassy, lighter flavor, and it doesn't hit you in the face the same way an Isla does, but it really is gorgeous, and you can just go through the different layers of complexity in it and enjoy the subtlety of it.
Any experience? Do you have any experience with new make?
Yes, I do.
Any? Now, from what I've been told, and I actually have no experience with it, is just that it tends to lack a lot of the character that gets developed by sort of being in the barrel. Have you had any experiences with new make that you felt were pretty good?
I like the Octomore new make. I belong to 2 whiskey organizations, and one of them called the Ploughed Society. Some of the members, when they go on tours, they manage to get some new make. I'm told that they were on a tour. I wasn't there for this one, and they were in a distillery, and one of them noticed a pipe that was leaking whiskey, and new make was coming out. So rather than say, hey, there's a leak over here, they simply grabbed a sample bottle and stuck it under the pipe and got as much new make as they can. And for the next 3 or 4 years, that bottle went to every tasting and everyone got to try it, which I think is great because then I got to try it. So, but that's the Ploughed attitude, which is like, hey, this is an opportunity. This is not a crisis. It's certainly not the whiskey they intend you to drink. I know, according to what I've read, people who work at distilleries prefer new make many times over the finished product. that's what the workers would rather drink. At one point in the industry, when people were working so hard in terms of turning the grain and all the other laborious things they do, they would give them regular whiskey breaks and reward them with whiskey. And when
Sounds
they
like
had
a great job.
and supposedly there's a story at on Isla at Colila's distillery, which has huge windows that look out over onto the water, and it's the most beautiful still room on Isla. And supposedly the one of the people in charge gave a workman a large container of raw whiskey and said, "Please clean the windows with this." And then 3 hours later, the guy was like, kind of like slurring his speech and stuff, and he said, "Did you clean the windows?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I drank some. I cleaned the windows a little bit, but mostly I drank it." Because for him, new make was his favorite thing, and if you give him a jug of it, he's going to drink it. They've now cut back on that, and as far as I know, they don't do that necessarily anymore. But that used to be the standard way of rewarding workers, which was, here's your whiskey dram for the morning and the afternoon, and it had to make for an interesting day, I guess.
Yeah, I wonder how that would sort of hold up to modern maybe regulations, things of that nature.
Cleaning the windows with whiskey, that's maybe we should try that.
Yeah, we should try.
Your house would smell better.
Yeah.
Guys, forget Windex. We're just gonna... Oh, that's great.
So I know you had mentioned a few times, different times you had spent in Scotland. How many times have you been out, you think?
I've been to Scotland 4 times.
Okay.
And I can't wait to go back, and I want to go to my favorite place is Isla, but there's a place that I was only at really for literally less than an hour, and that was Campbellton. So I want to go to the Campbellton Festival and drink lots of Springbank and Longgrow, and I know I would enjoy that. I've been to the festival on Isla, Fay Shiel, and I've been to Edinburgh multiple times, and I've been to Glasgow, and they're beautiful cities, and they're lots of fun to go to. But visiting distilleries and enjoying them, I've been to the Isle of Skye and visited Talisker. And you meet people in the industry, and the attitude is the same everywhere, which is, what can we do to make your experience more enjoyable? There's no sense of competition between the distilleries. They're like, oh, you're in Isla and you want to hit 3 distilleries in one afternoon? Great. If you come to ours, we can do this, and then you go down the street to this one, and then down to the other one, and they'll help you plan your whole day without any preference, you have to go to ours first kind of thing. And that's really nice, that there's just a sense of mutual respect, and that if you like their whiskey, it doesn't mean you hate other whiskeys. It just means they're glad that you like their whiskey.
Do you find employees move between the distilleries pretty often?
People do move on. I don't know enough employees to make any real judgment on that, but I mean, there's plenty of people who have experience at multiple distilleries who just keep moving up and up and up, which is great. And there are people who were born on Isla and for the last 3 generations lived on Isla, and their grandfather worked in the warehouse for 50 years, and they've been, nonstop working in the industry their whole life. So those are incredible people to meet and talk with when you can.
Yeah, no,
Sure.
that is really something.
They probably have a wealth of knowledge about that particular distillery that you just can't find anywhere else. It's really awesome.
Now, one thing I see a lot, and sort of the reason that came to mind for me, is for example, the computer industry or the audio industry. A lot of the big names sometimes just jump ship, make their own companies, or sort of get signed to a big contract with another organization to sort of help them, revamp their brand, things like that. You see things like that in the whiskey community much?
Absolutely. A lot of people have left working for one distillery and formed their own company. John Glazer of Compass Box used to work for other people and then decided to do his own thing. And there's other people who just felt they needed to to go their own way, or they were disillusioned by what the distillery was doing, or they felt they weren't being heard. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of independent bottlers that get to express their feelings based on the kind of whiskey they put out versus what they could if they were in the industry directly working for just one distillery. And for me, I just welcome variety. So if someone wants to go out and try something new, I want to try it. So I'm interested in that.
We had talked kind of at length yesterday about the teaspoon whiskeys.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
When a distillery sells whiskey to an independent bottler, they have to decide whether they're going to let the independent bottler use the name of their distillery on the bottle or not. And I'm told that they base it on whether they think the whiskey has distillery characteristics that they agree with. And if it does, they'll let the bottler, put the name of the distillery. And if it doesn't, they will say you can't call it Lafroig or Ardbeg or whatever it is. And one of the techniques to prevent that is to take a teaspoon of whiskey from a nearby distillery or any distillery and add that to the barrel or barrels, and that way it is no longer a single malt, and it has been teaspooned with this other whiskey, which of course has zero effect on the flavor. And I recently purchased 20-year-old Ardbeg. The 19-year-old was selling for 300 and change, 400 from the distillery, and the 20-year-old that was teaspooned was selling for $134. So it was like, do I want to spend $400? Do I want to spend $100? So I bought, the teaspooned Ardbeg. Will it bring as much money on the secondary market if I wanted to sell it? Absolutely not. However, will I enjoy drinking it with my friends? Yeah, you can bet I will. So, and because the price was so much lower, I could afford to get more bottles. So
That's fair. But it seems like you're not really into selling whiskeys on the secondary market anyway. It's more of buying to, at some point, enjoy, yes?
the goal is to drink it and enjoy it. There have been a couple bottles that I drank, and then I had more bottles, so I knew what it tasted like. And then the secondary market price went so insanely high that when I needed some funds, I sold it because the return on investment was ridiculous.
Sure.
So, and had I opened it and drank it, I would have enjoyed it, but I would have felt guilty that I didn't take the money. So there are a few times when I needed to that I sold some whiskey. But again, they're usually ones that I bought 2 or 3 or 4 of, and after drinking multiple ones, I'm like, okay, I know what this tastes like, and now that it's going to bring me so much money, I don't mind selling off a couple.
Oh, that's fair.
But that's not the reason I buy whiskey. It's the reason I buy bourbon and other things. There's a couple times where I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and a liquor store just had gotten its allotment of X number of whatever American whiskeys that are very hard to get, and I purchased them. And at one point, one liquor store said you can get the whole year's production of 6 different whiskeys for only $300, and it arrived in one box. And I took the box and put it up in my closet, and 10 years later I sold it and got a huge return on investment without ever opening the box. Because I had tasted the whiskeys in other places, and they hadn't done anything for me. So I bought them because I happened to be in the right place at the right time and used them as an investment vehicle. But that's not how I feel. For the bulk of the stuff I buy, it's to drink.
Where do you typically list things on the secondary market?
I have a friend who runs whiskey auctions in the Boston area, and it's a major company, Skinner, and he works for them. He used to work for a company in New York, so I've sold stuff through him because he's reliable and honest, and he can tell you ahead of time what the most recent auction prices have brought, so you can have some idea of where it's going to go. And all the dealings I've had with him have been above board and really, worth it and reliable. And attending those auctions whenever possible are fun. I used to go to all the ones in New York and just watch people go crazy bidding on whiskey. So, and then of course I'd want to bid on a few myself, and I'd have to be careful about that. So
Lose all the gains you made.
well, that's very. You can easily spend more than what you're selling for. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
no,
fair.
I think it's probably kind of a cliche question, but if you were maybe going to pick only one region, I might venture to guess based off the collection it might be Islay, but if you were going to pick only one region of Scotland to source whiskey from, let's say here on out, what would it be?
It would probably be Islay. If I only had to pick one whiskey, though, a desert island whiskey, it would be Springbank.
Mm. Yeah, no, I honestly wasn't particularly familiar with them outside of the fact that some of their bottles, sell for a lot. But, what do you find makes it so special and hold such a place in your regard?
The balance, the coastal air, the coconut flavor. It's very complex and just incredibly succulent and attractive when it's done well. And at some point, I'm going to open another 21-year-old, the old 21. And when you taste that, I think that'll be the ultimate answer. You'll go, I get it. Now I understand.
Yeah, no, one thing I don't know how much we had mentioned or not was, relatively speaking, your incredible collection, and so it was a pretty funny story you had mentioned about coming across those Springbanks. Care to share that?
At one point, I guess maybe 15 years ago, I noticed that the older Springbanks were beginning to disappear from the stores and not being replaced by anything. And they're known for irregular production and not always having older stuff. And sometimes they don't have younger stuff and they put older stuff in the younger stuff. There's a famous 12-year-old Springbank that there's two versions, a lighter version and a darker version, and at one point they were selling for $60 a bottle, and there was almost no 12-year-old because the guy running the distillery had said, I don't have enough 12-year-old to do this bottling, I'm just going to put a bunch of older whiskey in there. And so anyone who tasted it knew immediately it was older whiskey, but at $60 a bottle, back then, it was insane. And that became one of the unicorns that I hunted down and was lucky enough to get a bottle. And it was spectacular whiskey at a fraction of the price. But then we'll have to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah.
The story about
the
acquiring the 21. So I started crisscrossing different parts of Manhattan on my bicycle, stopping at every liquor store, and I found one that had 2 6-packs of the 21-year-old on sale for $125. They now go for $600 to $1,200, maybe even higher, $1,500, depending on where you're buying it. And I said to the guy, I would like both 6-packs, and I will pay you in cash. And then I figured, let's push it even further. And I said, okay, and I don't want to pay the tax. And the guy had to go, and he was like, okay. And what I was thinking was, man, I would have paid the tax. I would have paid more than that if you had said no. But so I walked out of there with a fantastic deal, and he was happy to move both 6-packs. And I still have most of those bottles still in my collection, but I've been drinking them bit by bit because that's what it's for.
Absolutely, made to be drank.
Yeah.
I guess one last thing, since your collection is pretty big, obviously you have a number of bottles that are open all at one point in time. Can you tell our viewers what happens to a bottle if it sits for a bit too long open?
Well, what I have learned firsthand is you either have to transfer it to a smaller bottle, or you have to use an inert gas, such as argon, to block oxygen from hitting it, or you have to use the vacuum system of pumping the air out, which they use for wine sometimes, or some other method that I haven't heard of, but the whiskey can oxidize. And I've lost a lot of very good whiskey to oxidation because I wasn't drinking it fast enough. And some whiskeys will oxidize within a matter of a year and a half, and some will oxidize over a much longer period. And unfortunately, I'm very sensitive to oxidation, and I've noticed that the progression starts with the flavor profile is a little bit blunted, so all the high and low points that you used to enjoy in the whiskey, they just aren't there anymore. And I have a good sense memory for when I open a whiskey, what it's like. and I can tell when a whiskey is starting to oxidize. It seems sooner than other people, and I wish I didn't have that ability. I would just like to be able to drink all my whiskey. And after that, it gets more cardboardy, and then finally it gets soapy. And when it reaches the soapy stage, and when I taste soap, I will pour it down the drain because I'm not pouring soap for other people. It's just terrible. The other ones I will give away to people who aren't as sensitive to oxidation because I can't drink it anymore.
Sure.
And I used to have a lot of, I still do have a lot of open whiskey, and my goal is to cut that down to just maybe 10 bottles. And so I need people to come over and drink. And you guys have been very helpful, but I need more assistance so we can get the open bottles down to just a small amount, and then I can open up new bottles.
It's such a labor coming over.
Yeah.
Here.
Oh, gosh.
Whiskey.
It's horrible.
Gosh, it's so difficult. But
we'd be happy to oblige.
one other thing that sort of come to my mind, and it might come across as a bit of a peculiar thing. So in like the sound, audio community, there are a lot of people that myself identify as like extreme like objectivists, who are sort of obsessed with the numbers, and who sort of reject the idea that you should just listen and see how you feel about things. And because of that, they reject a lot of sort of components of the audio community as a waste of money or a snake oil a sort of tactic. Do you feel that there's any element of whiskey, like for example, some folks have sort of said that, drinking out of tulip-shaped glasses or Glencairn glasses doesn't offer a performance benefit, or that particular styles of whiskey, things like that, maybe there isn't necessarily a performance benefit, or age statements, things like that. Anything sort of comparable you feel like in the whiskey community?
Well, I think it depends on your level of knowledge. When you're first drinking whiskey, you're just going to go, do I like it? Do I not like it? And then when you've been drinking for a while, you go, oh, I like this kind of whiskey, or I like that kind. And then after drinking longer, you might say, hey, I like this age of whiskey versus that. And then you realize that one distillery does younger whiskey better, one distillery does older whiskey better. It depends how much marketing garbage you swallow, because they're going to market you to the more expensive thing, older thing all the time. And the fact is, some whiskeys are better as a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old than they are as a 20 or 25. It's really a matter of being confident in your own ability to taste and enjoy, and being always aware that the reason you're drinking this stuff is to have fun and enjoy it. And if someone starts telling you why you shouldn't be enjoying it, then it's time to listen to somebody else.
Oh, that's fair. There was that time we were at the Ashton Cigar Bar, and we had tasted other offerings, but we had the Nika 21, and it was smooth. It was it wasn't offensive, but I can't really speak for you, but I was hoping for so much more. Out of the Nika 21, because we'd had the coffee malt, we'd had the coffee grain, those were very good. I've had Nika from the barrel, that was enjoyable to me, but the 21 was just like, sure, it's good, I guess, but gosh, it's so expensive, and it doesn't really seem to be any better, possibly even worse than the younger offerings. We kind of
Good example
had
of that.
that experience, yeah. So it is interesting sometimes how that comes to pass. Wow. So anyway, though, Peter, you're an insight. You're just like your level of knowledge and your experience with all of this is just absolutely incredible. And
I'm the old guy shouting, "Get off my lawn." That's my job.
Any particular things that you'd want to shout out, or any closing remarks?
Just be willing to go and try things, and go to, right now they're not having tastings in bars, but they're beginning to have outdoor seating and stuff. And, I would go to local places that have a whiskey collection and try different things. And if they can pour you a half pour and for half the price, or bring someone with you who wants to try whiskeys and split it between the two of you. The goal is to try as many different things as you can and see what you like, and then see what you want to own a bottle of after you've tried it, versus spending the money and having something you don't like. So that's what I did. I built my vocabulary up by trying as many things as I could, going to as many tasting events as I could. And a lot of organizations are running now where you sign up and then pay for samples, and they mail you the samples, and then you do the tasting online with them. And I've done that successfully several times with the Drammers Club, which now has clubs all over the world.
Oh, wow.
There's one in New York City, and there's one in Los Angeles, and there's one on Long Island, and I don't know if there's a New Jersey chapter or not, but there are people in New Jersey who are members. Drammersclub.com, and they have a big Facebook presence, and it's not always cheap. Sometimes it is very affordable, but the stuff they're pouring is insane. They source really incredible whiskeys, which you just won't find in any bar on any regular basis. They go onto the secondary market, and if they're going to do a tasting, they'll try to get 10, 12 or more expressions of something, or a grouping of something, and they'll get things that you just can't buy anymore, or if you could, you'd spend a huge amount of money. So if you're going to try that many things and it costs $100, that's a really good deal. And there's enough in each little sample bottle for you to share with a friend, so you could easily sit down and split the cost of it at $50 a person, trying 10 or 12 whiskeys that you can't get otherwise. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good deal. So I would recommend something like that if possible. The guy in charge is named Charlie, and he's a wonderful guy, very nice. There's no snobbery involved. And then the other choice is to learn about a couple whiskeys, start having tasting in your own home, share it with friends. If you go outside in the backyard and socially distance, you can do it safely, and then form your own club and have people bring different bottles so you can have variety and try different things, and coordinate that and start trying more things, and whatever you can do to support local bars, because if they're still in business, they're desperate, and they need people to come and support them, because all the people in that industry have been pretty much wiped out by COVID.
Yes.
So anything that's going to reopen and you can support it, I would highly recommend that.
But hey, really appreciate you coming out, spending your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, as it seems to be, as it always is.
Yeah.
But hey, if you're liking the content, please subscribe. Give us a like. Give us some comments. If you have any questions for Peter, we can relay them to him and get you some answers, perhaps.
Be sure to tap that bell if you want to get notifications of our latest videos coming out. That's the real subscribe button there. And do be sure to check us out on social media as well. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and believe it or not, we also have a Twitter. So definitely check us out there. We have some really cool content and some behind-the-scenes footage. So it should be a blast.
But yeah, absolutely. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.